Hey, I'm Andrew Connell. What you're about to watch is the overview lesson to one of the chapters in my MS-600 Exam Prep Guide course. This course is available for purchase on my site, voitanos.io. I'll include a link to it in the description below the video. This overview video, which is the first lesson of the chapter that you selected, gives you an idea of what the chapter is going to cover. You can learn more by checking out the description below the video about this chapter. If you've got any questions about the chapter or the course, just drop a comment below the video and I'll be sure to get back to you. So with that, let me get out of the way. Enjoy the overview lesson from this chapter. Hello and welcome back. In this chapter, I'm going to focus on the workload called Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph is a huge topic as it's just an API, but thankfully the MS-600 exam scope is limited to just some specific aspects of Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph provides a unified programmability model that developers can leverage to access nearly all data within Microsoft 365, Windows 10, and enterprise mobility and security. Now, this workload accounts for 10 to 15% of the questions in the question pool that could show up when you take the exam. Microsoft Identity is the cornerstone of everything in Microsoft 365, as I covered in the previous chapter. But a vast majority of the applications that you build for SharePoint, Microsoft Teams or Office or whatever in Microsoft 365, they're all going to utilize data that's located elsewhere in Microsoft 365. And the recommended way that you'll access all of that data is with one of the various APIs or SDKs that are provided by Microsoft Graph. Now that you know what Microsoft Graph is and how much of the exam accounts for it, let's look at the depth of knowledge that you need to have in these various areas. Recall Bloom's taxonomy from the overview chapter in this course. Let's use that to provide some context around what you need to know, because it helps to understand how deep you need to know something before embarking on studying for that topic. This helps you grasp the level of questions that you'll see in the exam. When you look at these skills checklists that Microsoft provides in the MS-600 exam, you'll notice most skills include the following words: describe, identify, use, create, implement, and plan. These phrases fall across the entire spectrum of the taxonomy. And this means for Microsoft Graph, we're going to focus on the entire pyramid of the taxonomy, all the way from the lower order thinking skills like remember and understand, all the way up to the higher order thinking skills like evaluate and create. Now let's take a minute to explore what lessons you'll find in this chapter so that you know what to expect as you proceed through the Microsoft Graph chapter. In this current overview lesson, you've learned what Microsoft Graph workload is all about. And on the next slide, I'm going to wrap up this lesson with some additional learning resources. So be sure to check the notes for this lesson under the video below for a collection of all the external references I use throughout this chapter. The Microsoft Graph workload is quite large because it's just an API, and any discussion on an API can take forever because APIs by their very nature contain a ton of endpoints. But you don't need to know everything about this topic in order to pass the exam. So in the next lesson, I'm going to call out specific things that you need to focus on, as well as things that you can ignore as they aren't relevant to the exam. In the next lesson, I'll cover the optimization patterns and practices that Microsoft 365 wants you to know. These are so important to applications and Microsoft Graph usage that Microsoft added them as part of the core questions that you'll see on the MS-600 exam. We'll cover how to control the amount and size of data returned, patterns to employ to avoid from being throttled, and how to handle those instances where your requests are throttled. The next 3 lessons tackle 3 different endpoints made available via Microsoft Graph that the MS-600 exam will question you on. These include users, files, and groups. And then just like all the other chapters in this course, I'm going to keep the depth of the explanation to the level of what you need to know in order to pass the exam. I'm not going to try to go too deep with my explanations because this is an exam prep course. It's not that it's intended to teach you about everything about these topics. There are plenty of other resources available that you can leverage if you aren't familiar with a particular topic. When I cover something in the course, you may think, okay, I got it. I'm comfortable with my knowledge on this topic. But if you think to yourself, I don't get it, or if you aren't familiar with a process or an API that I'm going to cover, you should go read up on the official documentation or study one of the multiple resources that I'm referencing throughout the course to make sure you're adequately familiar with the topic prior to taking the exam. Now, I'll reference specific resources throughout the course, but like I said before, be sure to check the notes for this lesson under the video for a collection of all the external references I use throughout this chapter. But on this slide, I want to quickly run through the Microsoft Learning resources that I'm providing and explain what's in each one of these. The first group of links is around Microsoft Learning. They have learning paths and modules, and a learning path is a collection of modules that are all strung together. The learning path for Microsoft Graph is called Build Apps with Microsoft Graph Associate, and it contains the modules used for self-paced study for the exam. We've got 5 modules that cover various topics that I'll reference throughout this chapter. All of these contain hands-on labs if you want to practice some of the topics that you may want to have some additional experience with prior to taking the exam. These modules are optimize data usage when using Microsoft Graph with query parameters, optimize network traffic with Microsoft Graph, access user data from Microsoft Graph, manage group lifecycle with Microsoft Graph, access files with Microsoft Graph, and use change notifications and track changes with Microsoft Graph. Now, there are additional modules that are part of this learning path, such as one that addresses creating ASP.NET applications with Microsoft Graph. This one isn't important for preparing for the MS-600 exam, so I've excluded that from this list. The one about change notifications and track changes, that has some overlap with the optimized network traffic module, so feel free to go through both of those to get a solid grasp of these techniques. Every Microsoft Learning module includes steps to register an Azure AD application and configure the app in the associated hands-on labs for Microsoft Identity. You don't have to spend too much time on these parts of the modules because while it's required and important to complete the labs, there's nothing unique about Microsoft Graph when it comes to Microsoft Identity. Microsoft Identity workload chapter, as well as the Microsoft Learning modules that I covered in that chapter, include everything that you need to know with respect to Microsoft Identity when it comes to the Microsoft Graph. Now, the Microsoft Graph documentation contains a ton of documentation as well on their site. I'll reference a bunch of the individual links in the lesson notes, but you can always start at their docs homepage, located at docs.microsoft.com/graph/overview. Okay, that wraps up this overview lesson. And in the next lesson, we're going to cover what topics that you need to know and what topics you can avoid. So I'll see you in the next lesson.